November 24, 1944. Captain Takeo Yamada, a Japanese naval aviator captured at Saipan 5 months earlier, stood near the chain-link fence of his prisoner-of-war compound as the ground began to shake. The Americans had told him something was coming, something that would change everything. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the first Boeing B-29 Superfortress began its takeoff roll, then another, and another. Within minutes, 111 of the massive bombers roared down Northfield's coral runways, their Wright R-3350 Duplex Cyclone engines screaming at maximum power. Each aircraft carried 7 tons of bombs, each one headed northwest, toward Tokyo. Yamada watched in stunned silence as the silver giants climbed into the tropical sky and disappeared over the horizon. He had been taught his entire military career that such a mission was impossible. The distance from the Marianas to Tokyo was approximately 1,500 miles, round trip nearly 3,000 miles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. No bomber in the world could fly that far carrying a meaningful bomb load and return, yet he had just witnessed it with his own eyes. What Yamada and thousands of other Japanese prisoners of war held in Allied camps would come to understand over the following 9 months was not merely that America possessed a remarkable aircraft. They would witness the complete demolition of every assumption Japanese military doctrine had made about strategic bombing, industrial capacity, and the fundamental nature of American power. The B-29 represented more than technological achievement. It embodied a philosophy of warfare that Japan had never imagined possible. For Japanese prisoners scattered across camps in Australia, New Zealand, India, and the United States, the B-29 became the physical manifestation of their nation's strategic miscalculation. They would watch these aircraft depart on missions that Japanese planners had declared impossible. They would see them return, day after day, in numbers that increased rather than diminished, and they would be forced to confront a terrible truth. Japan had gone to war against an enemy whose industrial and technological capabilities exceeded anything their military leaders had anticipated. The story of how Japanese prisoners of war came to understand American air power through the B-29 is ultimately a story about the collapse of certainty. These men had believed in Japanese superiority. They had trusted their commanders' assurances. They had accepted the propaganda that promised inevitable victory. The sight of B-29s, flying 3,000 miles to bomb their homeland, would systematically destroy every one of those beliefs. The road to that moment on Tinian began years earlier, in the planning rooms of Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. By 1937, Japan's military expansion in China had created an insatiable appetite for resources. Oil, rubber, tin, iron ore, all the materials necessary for modern warfare existed in the European colonies of Southeast Asia. But obtaining those resources meant confronting the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Japanese strategic planning operated under several critical assumptions. First, that any conflict with America would be decided quickly, before American industrial mobilization could reach full capacity. Second, that distance would protect Japan from sustained aerial attack. Third, that American resolve would crack when faced with the costs of reconquering a vast Pacific empire. Each assumption seemed reasonable based on the military technology of the early 1940s. The longest-range American heavy bomber in service when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. With a combat radius of approximately 800 miles, the B-17 could not reach Japan from any Allied base in 1941. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had similar range limitations. Japanese military planners studied these aircraft carefully. They understood that conventional strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands required bases impossibly distant from American control. Distance had always been Japan's shield. The home islands lay thousands of miles from potential enemy bases. Even if America captured territories in the Pacific, Japanese planners believed bombers would need to fly from China, requiring a logistical nightmare of fuel and supply transportation, or from bases that wouldn't exist for years. By the time such bases became operational, Japanese strategists assumed the war would already be decided through negotiated settlement. This assumption shaped Japan's entire defensive strategy. Naval aviation focused on carrier-based aircraft for offensive operations and land-based fighters for point defense of critical installations. Japan built no long-range strategic bomber force because Japanese doctrine saw no role for such aircraft. The idea of sustained aerial assault on enemy homelands from bases thousands of miles away existed only in the realm of theoretical discussion, not practical military planning. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was designed specifically to shatter this assumption. Development began in 1938, 3 years before Pearl Harbor, when the Army Air Corps issued specifications for a very long-range bomber. The requirements seemed almost fantastical. A range of 2,000 miles with a 4,000-pound bomb load, maximum speed exceeding 350 miles per hour, operating altitude above 30,000 feet, and defensive armament sufficient to ward off fighter attacks. Boeing's design team, led by Edmund T. Allen, created an aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. The B-29 stretched 99 feet from nose to tail with a wingspan of 141 feet, 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove the massive bomber through the air. But the revolutionary features went far beyond size and power. The B-29 was the first production bomber with a fully pressurized cabin, allowing crews to operate at extreme altitude without bulky oxygen equipment. Remote-controlled gun turrets, coordinated by analog computers, provided defensive firepower without the weight and drag of manned gun positions. Sophisticated radar navigation equipment enabled operation in darkness and through weather that would ground conventional bombers. Every system incorporated cutting-edge technology for 1943. The aircraft's performance specifications exceeded anything in Japanese intelligence estimates. Maximum range, 3,250 miles. Service ceiling, 31,850 feet. Cruising speed, 220 miles per hour. Bomb load, 20,000 pounds maximum, though typical combat loads ran between 7 and 10 tons depending on fuel requirements. These numbers meant that from bases in the Mariana Islands, approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, the B-29 could reach any target in Japan and return. But building the aircraft proved extraordinarily difficult. The B-29 pushed the limits of 1940s manufacturing technology. The pressurization system required precision sealing unheard of in aircraft construction. The engines, delivering unprecedented power, ran dangerously hot and required careful monitoring. The analog fire control computers represented the most sophisticated mechanical computing devices ever installed in an aircraft. Quality control became critical. Any flaw could prove catastrophic. Boeing devoted its Wichita, Kansas plant entirely to B-29 production. Bell Aircraft in Marietta, Georgia, and Glenn, L. Martin in Omaha, Nebraska, also built Superfortresses under license. At peak production, these 3 facilities delivered approximately 150 B-29s monthly. Between 1943 and 1945, American factories produced 3,970 Superfortresses at a total cost, exceeding $3 billion more than the Manhattan Project that would develop atomic weapons. The first B-29s entered combat service in June 1944 as part of Operation Matterhorn. This ambitious but flawed plan based the bombers in India with forward staging fields near Chengdu in western China. The logistics proved nightmarish. All fuel, bombs, and supplies for the Chengdu bases had to be flown over the Himalayan mountains, the notorious hump route that consumed more fuel in transport than the bombers could use against Japanese targets. On June 15, 1944, 68 B-29s staged through Chengdu to attack the Yawata Iron and Steel Works on Kyushu, Japan's southernmost home island. The raid marked the first aerial attack on Japan since the Doolittle raid of April 1942, more than 2 years earlier. Damage to the target proved minimal. Only 47 bombers reached Yawata, and only 1 bomb actually hit the primary target, but the psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. Distance had been breached. The sacred home islands were no longer safe. Although Yawata lay at the extreme limit of the B-29's range from China, the raid demonstrated that American bombers could reach Japan. Japanese commanders understood immediately that if America could attack from China, they would seek bases closer to Japan. The race to capture or defend strategic islands across the Pacific took on new urgency. The solution to the logistical nightmare of operations from China was already in motion. In June 1944, American forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, located approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, represented ideal bomber bases. The islands were large enough to support major air operations but small enough to defend. More critically, they could be supplied by sea, eliminating the crippling logistics problems that plagued operations from China. The battle for Saipan was savage. Approximately 25,000 Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination. Mass civilian suicides shocked American forces as entire families leaped from cliffs rather than surrender. When organized resistance ended on July 9, 1944, over 24,000 Japanese soldiers and approximately 12,000 civilians had died. American casualties exceeded 16,000. Among the prisoners taken at Saipan was Captain Takeo Yamada, shot down during a futile attempt to attack American invasion forces. Like most Japanese military personnel, Yamada had expected to die rather than surrender. His survival brought shame and confusion. Japanese military culture considered surrender the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers were taught that capture meant permanent loss of honor. Death in battle was infinitely preferable to the humiliation of prisoner status. Yet Yamada survived, and following his capture experienced something entirely unexpected: decent treatment. American forces processed prisoners according to the Geneva Convention protocols. Medical care treated his wounds. Regular rations, while basic, exceeded what Japanese soldiers on Saipan had received during the final weeks of the siege. Most shocking to Yamada was the absence of brutality. He had been taught that Americans tortured prisoners. Instead, he found systematic, bureaucratic processing. The initial interrogation sessions revealed how thoroughly Japanese propaganda had misrepresented American capabilities. When questioned about his knowledge of American aircraft, Yamada mentioned the B-17 and B-24 bombers. His interrogators smiled and said he would soon see something far more impressive. Yamada dismissed this as typical enemy bragging. No bomber could possibly exceed the range and payload of aircraft he already knew. Within weeks of Saipan's capture, the United States Navy's construction battalions, the famous Seabees, began transforming the Marianas into the world's largest airbase. On Saipan, they built Isley Field with an 8,500-foot runway capable of handling B-29 operations. On Tinian, North Field became the largest bomber base ever constructed, with 4 parallel runways, each 8,500 feet long. On Guam, 2 major airfields rose from coral and jungle. The construction timeline was staggering. Within 3 months of securing the islands, the Seabees had built operational airfields complete with bomb storage facilities, fuel farms, maintenance hangars, and support infrastructure. The scale of construction exceeded anything in Japanese military engineering experience. Hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment operated around the clock. Ships arrived daily with construction materials, fuel, bombs, and supplies. Yamada and other prisoners working on labor details witnessed this transformation directly. The first B-29s began arriving in the Marianas in October 1944. For Yamada, watching these aircraft land at Isley Field produced conflicting emotions. As a pilot, he appreciated the Superfortress as a magnificent flying machine. The size alone was overwhelming, far larger than any Japanese bomber, but appreciation mixed with dread. These aircraft represented a capability Japan could not match or counter. Japanese military doctrine had always emphasized quality over quantity, superior training and spirit over material advantage. The Zero fighter, dominant in the war's early years, achieved success through lightweight and maneuverability, not firepower or protection. Japanese bombers like the Mitsubishi G4M prioritized range over defensive armament, accepting vulnerability in exchange for operational reach. This approach worked when facing numerically inferior opponents with less capable equipment. The B-29 destroyed this paradigm. Here was an aircraft that refused to choose between competing priorities. It had range and payload. It had altitude and firepower. It had sophistication and quantity. The Americans were not making trade-offs. They were building bombers that excelled in every category simultaneously. For Yamada, trained to believe that Japanese design philosophy represented the pinnacle of aerial engineering, the B-29 was incomprehensible. The bomber offensive began on November 24, 1944, with Operation San Antonio I. 111 B-29s from the 73rd Bombardment Wing departed Saipan, targeting the Musashino aircraft factory near Tokyo. This was the mission Yamada witnessed from his compound. Weather over the target area proved terrible. Only 88 aircraft managed to drop bombs, and only 24 hit the primary target. But one B-29 was lost. From a damage assessment standpoint, the mission accomplished little. From a psychological standpoint, it was devastating to Japanese morale. The emperor's capital had been bombed, the sacred homeland violated, and the Americans had done it with a casualty rate that seemed almost casual. Japanese defenders shot down one bomber out of 111. At that exchange rate, American forces could continue indefinitely, while Japan's defenses steadily eroded. For Yamada and other Japanese prisoners, November 24th marked the beginning of their education about American industrial capacity. They had known intellectually that America was large and productive, but knowing statistics and witnessing reality were entirely different experiences. Watching over 100 B-29s depart on a single mission, understanding that each aircraft represented tens of thousands of man-hours of production, calculating the fuel consumption, bomb load, and logistical support required this provided visceral comprehension of industrial scale that no intelligence briefing could convey. The missions continued with increasing frequency. December brought multiple strikes against Japanese aircraft factories, naval facilities, and urban areas. January 1945 saw the arrival of the 313th Bombardment Wing on Tinian, doubling the number of B-29s operational in the Marianas. February brought the 314th Wing to Guam. By March, over 500 superfortresses were based in the Marianas, with more arriving weekly. Yamada kept a mental tally, scratching marks in the dirt to track missions. By late December, American forces had flown over 30 major bombing raids against Japan from the Marianas. The numbers defied his understanding of logistics and industrial production. Each mission required thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. Each bomb run expended hundreds of tons of high explosives. Each aircraft needed regular maintenance, replacement parts, and eventual replacement after accumulating combat damage. Where did all this material come from? How could one nation produce such quantities? Japanese factories struggled to build 100 aircraft monthly. American bases in the Marianas alone were operating 500 bombers, with that number increasing monthly. The mathematics of production told a story of overwhelming disparity that Yamada had been trained to ignore but could no longer deny. The weather over Japan during winter months proved challenging for high-altitude precision bombing. Jet stream winds at 30,000 feet, unknown to meteorologists until B-29 crews discovered them, created havoc with bomb accuracy. Aircraft flying with the jet stream watched their bombs sail beyond targets. Against the jet stream, bombs fell short. Early missions achieved disappointing results despite the effort and expense of mounting them. Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. LeMay, a veteran of strategic bombing campaigns over Germany, recognized that current tactics were failing. High-altitude precision bombing, effective in Europe, produced minimal results over Japan. The jet stream winds, frequent cloud cover, and difficulty in identifying targets from extreme altitude all conspired against the daylight precision approach. LeMay made a controversial decision. B-29s would attack at night, from low altitude, using incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The new tactics eliminated the advantages that had made the B-29 revolutionary pressurized high-altitude operations, but promised to multiply effectiveness against Japanese urban industrial targets. Most Japanese manufacturing occurred in small workshops scattered throughout residential areas. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Area bombing with incendiaries would destroy these distributed production facilities, along with the workers' housing. The first test of the new tactics came on March 9 through 10, 1945. 334 B-29s from 3 wings converged on Tokyo in the largest bomber raid of the war to date. Flying between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, the superfortresses dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs across the capital's most densely populated districts. The results were catastrophic. Fires merged into a conflagration that consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo. Approximately 100,000 people died in a single night, more than either atomic bombing that would follow in August. The firestorm created hurricane-force winds that sucked people into flames. Rivers boiled, metal melted. Survivors described scenes from hell itself. American crews, flying above the inferno, smelled burning flesh through their oxygen masks. News of the Tokyo firebombing reached prisoner-of-war camps through various channels. Guards discussed it. Japanese radio broadcasts reported it, though with vastly understated casualty figures. But the most compelling evidence came from the B-29s themselves. Yamada and other prisoners could see the bombers departing and returning. They could count the aircraft. They could observe the loading operations. The scale of the offensive was undeniable. What devastated Yamada more than the casualty figures was the sustainability of the operation. Japan had conducted occasional terror bombing raids against Chinese cities early in the war. These operations consumed tremendous resources and could not be maintained. After a major raid, Japanese air units needed weeks to refit and prepare for the next mission. The Americans conducted the March 10 Tokyo raid and then repeated similar missions night after night against city after city. 66 Japanese cities suffered major incendiary attacks between March and August 1945. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama each received the same treatment as Tokyo. American forces refined their tactics with each raid. Initial attacks hit district fire departments and water pumping stations, crippling firefighting capability before the main force arrived. Follow-up raids struck industrial facilities, transportation nodes, and remaining untouched areas. The systematic destruction proceeded with industrial efficiency. For Japanese prisoners witnessing this campaign, several realizations emerged simultaneously. First, American forces had achieved complete air superiority over Japan. The raids continued despite Japanese fighter and anti-aircraft opposition because American bomber losses remained acceptable. Second, the logistics supporting these operations were staggering. Each B-29 consumed over 5,000 gallons of fuel per mission. Multiply that by 300 aircraft and you needed 1.5 million gallons per raid. Where was all this fuel coming from? Third, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, was the casualness of American operations. The crews departing on these missions were not volunteers making once-in-a-lifetime sacrificial attacks. They were professional airmen executing routine missions as part of an ongoing campaign. They flew to Japan, dropped their bombs, and returned for another mission a few days later. This normalization of what should have been extraordinary operations revealed depths of industrial and organizational capacity that Japanese military planning had never anticipated. Prisoners with technical backgrounds, like Yamada, conducted informal calculations. A B-29 weighed approximately 74,000 pounds empty and could carry up to 140,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and bombs. The aircraft's structural weight represented thousands of pounds of aluminum, steel, copper, rubber, and glass. A single bomber contained more strategic materials than a small factory. American forces were producing these aircraft at a rate exceeding 150 per month, while simultaneously building fighters, cargo aircraft, tanks, ships, and every other category of military equipment. Meanwhile, Japan's entire monthly aircraft production had declined to approximately 250 planes of all types combined. The disparity was crushing. Every B-29 that flew overhead represented a level of industrial output Japan could not begin to match. The treatment of Japanese prisoners in Allied camps varied by location, but generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards, despite Japan's refusal to recognize the convention. Yamada's experience on Tinian was typical. Prisoners received adequate rations, medical care when needed, and were generally spared the brutality that characterized Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. This civilized treatment created cognitive dissonance for men trained to expect torture and execution upon capture. Approximately 42,000 Japanese military personnel became prisoners of war before Japan's surrender. This represented an extraordinarily small fraction of Japanese forces, less than 1% testament to the cultural prohibition against surrender. Most prisoners were captured while wounded or unconscious. Yamada himself had been pulled from the wreckage of his aircraft by American sailors while semi-conscious from head trauma. Had he been fully alert, he likely would have chosen death. The small number of Japanese prisoners meant that Allied intelligence services subjected them to intensive interrogation. Officers like Yamada, with technical knowledge of aircraft and operations, proved especially valuable. American interrogators used sophisticated techniques that emphasized building rapport rather than coercion. Yamada found himself conversing in Japanese with American officers who had studied his language and culture. They treated him with respect, offered cigarettes, and seemed genuinely interested in his perspective. This approach proved remarkably effective. Japanese prisoners, believing they had broken all ties with Japan through the act of surrender, often provided detailed intelligence. Yamada described Japanese fighter tactics, aircraft specifications, and organizational structures. He explained Japanese military thinking with a clarity that proved invaluable to American planners. The intelligence gathered from Japanese prisoners of war significantly enhanced American operational planning throughout the Pacific Campaign. But the interrogations also worked in reverse. Through conversations with American officers, Yamada learned about B-29 operations in detail that shocked him. He learned that the Marianas bases represented only part of American bomber operations. B-29s also flew from China and India and from smaller bases throughout the Pacific. He learned that American industrial production was accelerating, not declining, as the war progressed. He learned that the bombers he watched departing Tinian represented a small fraction of overall American air power. Numbers that would have seemed like propaganda if presented formally became undeniable through casual conversation. An American intelligence officer mentioned that his brother worked at the Wichita Boeing plant, where they produced about 50 B-29s monthly. Another officer described seeing rows of hundreds of Superfortresses at a modification center in Nebraska. A crew member mentioned flying his third B-29 after combat damage had retired his previous two aircraft. Each fragment of information added to an emerging picture of industrial capacity that exceeded anything Yamada had imagined. By spring of 1945, the bombing campaign had achieved comprehensive results. Japanese war production essentially ceased. Oil refineries lay in ruins. Transportation networks were demolished. Urban industrial areas burned. Yet the raids continued. In June, July, and August, B-29s attacked smaller cities previously spared. The systematic destruction proceeded until there were no targets remaining. Yamada watched missions depart and return with the regularity of scheduled airline flights. Weather occasionally caused cancellations, but otherwise the operations continued like clockwork. This reliability represented another dimension of American capability that Japanese forces had never achieved. Japanese military operations were episodic, mounted with great effort, executed with desperation, then followed by long recovery periods. American operations were continuous, sustainable, and increasing in scale over time. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners was profound. Men who had believed in ultimate victory faced undeniable evidence of ultimate defeat. The propaganda they had been taught that American industry was decadent, that American workers were lazy, that American soldiers lacked fighting spirit collapsed under the weight of observable reality. Yamada had been told Americans were soft, yet American crews flew 14-hour missions through hostile airspace night after night without complaint. Some prisoners clung to desperate hope that Japanese forces would somehow turn the tide. They speculated about secret weapons under development, about Soviet intervention on Japan's side, about American war weariness forcing a negotiated settlement. But these hopes rang increasingly hollow as American bombers reduced Japan's cities to ash. By summer 1945, even the most devoted prisoners understood that Japan faced not mere defeat but complete destruction. The capture of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 added another dimension to prisoner awareness. Iwo Jima lay roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, perfectly positioned as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s. Japanese forces had fought with suicidal determination to hold the 8-square-mile island. Nearly 22,000 Japanese defenders died. American casualties exceeded 26,000, with nearly 7,000 killed. Yet America captured Iwo Jima and immediately transformed it into a vital link in the bombing campaign. Engineers lengthened runways, built fuel storage facilities, and established repair depots. Within weeks of the island's capture, B-29s were using Iwo Jima for emergency landings. Over the remaining months of the war, approximately 2,400 superfortresses made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving thousands of crew members who would otherwise have been lost at sea. For Yamada, the Iwo Jima operation exemplified everything Japan had failed to understand about American warfare. Japanese defenders had inflicted terrible casualties, yet America absorbed those losses and continued operations without pause. The engineering effort that transformed Iwo Jima happened almost casually, as if building major air bases on volcanic islands was routine, and the strategic calculation that saving damaged bombers justified an island assault costing 33,000 casualties revealed priorities Japan could not comprehend. Japanese military culture emphasized accepting casualties in pursuit of decisive battle. American military culture emphasized minimizing friendly losses through material superiority and careful planning. Japan believed spirit could overcome material disadvantage. America demonstrated that overwhelming material advantage made spirit less relevant. The two philosophies were fundamentally incompatible, and the outcome of their collision had become obvious. In the prisoner of war camps, informal discussions among Japanese personnel revealed the collapse of morale. Officers who had commanded men with absolute authority now questioned their own judgment. Enlisted men who had obeyed without question now wondered why their leaders had led them into unwinnable war. The social hierarchy that sustained Japanese military discipline began breaking down under the weight of shared defeat. Yamada found himself in lengthy conversations with fellow prisoners about what had gone wrong. Some blamed military leadership for poor planning. Others blamed politicians for starting a war they could not win. A few blamed Japanese industry for failing to match American production. But gradually, consensus emerged around a harder truth. Japan had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. Japanese military thought had emphasized human factors, training, discipline, courage, sacrifice. American military practice emphasized industrial factors, production capacity, logistics, sustainability, engineering. When these two philosophies clashed, the human factors proved insufficient against industrial superiority. Japanese pilots were brave. American pilots had more and better aircraft. Japanese soldiers were disciplined. American soldiers had better weapons and unlimited ammunition. Japanese commanders were creative. American commanders had overwhelming resources. The realization was bitter. Everything Yamada had been taught, everything he had believed about warfare and national power, had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in detail, but fundamentally and completely wrong. The entire edifice of Japanese military thought had been built on assumptions that 3 years of war had proven false. Spirit did not overcome material. Quality did not defeat quantity. Will did not substitute for resources. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th were almost anticlimactic for prisoners who had already accepted defeat. The new weapons were terrible, but in some ways less terrible than what B-29s had already done to Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities. The psychological impact of atomic bombs was that they made conventional defense impossible. Japanese authorities could not protect their people from weapons of such destructive power, but Japanese authorities had already proven unable to protect cities from conventional incendiary attack. The atomic bombs changed the speed of destruction, not the ultimate outcome. News of Japan's surrender on August 15th reached prisoner of war camps through various channels. Some heard it from guards, others learned through camp radio systems. Yamada heard it from an American officer who sought him out specifically to deliver the news personally. The officer treated him with remarkable sensitivity, understanding that surrender represented both relief and shame for Japanese prisoners. Yamada's first emotion was relief. The killing would stop. His family, if they had survived, might live through the post-war period, but relief quickly gave way to profound sadness. Japan's dream of a greater East Asia, co-prosperity sphere had ended in complete defeat and foreign occupation. The empire was shattered, the military was destroyed, the homeland lay in ruins. Everything Japanese forces had fought for was lost. In the weeks following surrender, American authorities began repatriation planning. Japanese prisoners would eventually return home, though the process would take months or years depending on circumstances. Many prisoners faced the post-war period with anxiety. They had surrendered while comrades fought to death. They had provided intelligence to the enemy. They had witnessed Japan's complete defeat. How would they be received by survivors who had suffered through the war in Japan? Before repatriation, however, came a period of transition. American authorities used this time for what might be called political re-education, though the methods were remarkably gentle compared to what that term would later imply in other contexts. Prisoners attended lectures on democracy, watched American films, and read uncensored newspapers. The goal was not to turn Japanese soldiers into Americans, but to expose them to ideas and perspectives their government had suppressed. For Yamada, the most impactful experiences came not from formal lectures but from informal interactions with American personnel. A guard mentioned that his father worked in a steel mill and belonged to a union that negotiated wages with management. A truck driver explained that he owned his own home despite being from a working-class family. A mechanic described attending community college on government assistance. These casual conversations revealed a society fundamentally different from Japan's rigid social hierarchy. The most difficult discussions concerned the treatment of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody. American authorities showed Japanese prisoners evidence of atrocities committed against American, British, Australian, and Filipino prisoners of war. The mortality rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese hands exceeded 40% compared to less than 1% in German camps. Brutal treatment, starvation, forced labor, and outright murder had characterized Japanese prisoner of war policy. Yamada struggled to reconcile these revelations with his own treatment. American forces had fed him adequately, provided medical care, protected him from harm. Japanese forces had starved, beaten, and murdered their prisoners. The contrast forced uncomfortable questions about which nation truly represented civilization and which represented barbarism. Everything he had been taught about Western decadence and Asian virtue now seemed inverted. The B-29 became, in Yamada's mind, a symbol of this inversion. He had believed Japanese aircraft design represented the pinnacle of engineering skill. The Zero fighter had dominated early air combat. Japanese bombers had struck Pearl Harbor. Japanese aviation technology seemed superior. Yet the B-29 revealed that American engineering had surpassed Japanese capabilities in every dimension that mattered for modern warfare. Range. The B-29 flew 3,000 miles round trip carrying 7 tons of bombs. Japanese bombers at war's start had range, but achieved it by sacrificing armor, armament, and safety. The G-4M bomber was so vulnerable that American pilots called it the one-shot lighter one-hit, and it ignited. The B-29 could absorb tremendous damage and continue flying. Its range came from efficient engines and large fuel capacity, not dangerous compromises. Altitude. The B-29 operated comfortably at 30,000 feet in pressurized comfort. Japanese fighters struggled to reach that altitude, and pilots who did suffered from hypoxia and cold. American crews breathed normally, worked in shirt sleeves, and fought at optimal efficiency even at extreme altitude. This seemingly small advantage multiplied combat effectiveness dramatically. Firepower. The B-29 mounted 12 50 caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets coordinated by analog computers. Gunners sat in protected positions using sophisticated sights. Japanese bombers relied on manually operated guns that required exposing crew members to hostile fire. The defensive armament disparity meant B-29s could survive fighter attacks that would destroy Japanese bombers. Payload: 7 to 10 tons of bombs per mission, multiplied by hundreds of aircraft, delivered destruction on scales Japanese forces could never approach. Japan's entire strategic bombing capability in China consisted of occasional raids by dozens of aircraft. American raids on Japan involved hundreds of bombers in single missions. The quantitative difference became qualitative. American forces could simply overwhelm any target through brute force. But beyond specific capabilities, what devastated Yamada most was the philosophy they represented. The B-29 was not designed for a single mission or a short campaign. It was designed for sustained strategic operations over years. American planners had looked at the requirements for bombing Japan and built an aircraft specifically for that purpose. Then they produced thousands of them. The entire program development, production, basing, logistics, operations reflected long-term strategic thinking that Japan had never achieved. Japanese military planning was tactical, focusing on immediate battles and assuming strategic outcomes would emerge from tactical victories. American military planning was strategic, focusing on war-winning capabilities and accepting that individual battles were merely steps toward ultimate victory. The B-29 embodied strategic thinking. It was built not to win a battle but to win a war through systematic destruction of enemy capacity. Yamada spent long hours in the months after surrender thinking about the 3,000-mile missions. That distance represented everything Japan had failed to understand about American power. Japanese planners had assumed distance would protect the homeland. Instead, America had simply built aircraft that made distance irrelevant. Japanese strategists had calculated that logistics would prevent sustained bombing. Instead, America had created logistical systems that delivered fuel and bombs to Pacific Islands as routinely as mail delivery. The numbers haunted him. 3,000 miles round trip, 14 to 16 hours airborne, 5,700 gallons of fuel consumed per aircraft per mission, multiple missions weekly, hundreds of aircraft. Over the final 9 months of the war, B-29s had flown more than 33,000 sorties against Japanese targets. They had dropped approximately 170,000 tons of bombs. These figures represented industrial and organizational capabilities beyond anything in Japanese experience. Other Japanese prisoners struggled with similar realizations. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, captured at Iwo Jima, had believed Japanese defenses would make American bombing prohibitively expensive. Instead, he witnessed B-29s operating with casualty rates low enough that crews completed full tours of duty. American losses were acceptable, sustainable, and continuously replaced. Japanese forces could not inflict enough damage to matter. Captain Kenji Suzuki, taken prisoner in the Philippines, had assumed American war production would eventually exhaust itself. Instead, production accelerated throughout the war, reaching peak output in 1945. These men represented the tiny fraction of Japanese military personnel who survived to see their homeland's defeat from outside. Their perspective differed fundamentally from those who experienced the war in Japan. Civilians in Tokyo or Osaka knew the terror of firebombing but understood it only as random disaster. Prisoners like Yamada understood it as systematic industrial destruction enabled by unprecedented engineering and logistics. They had seen the source. They had watched the bombers depart and return. They knew the raids were not random but methodical, not desperate gestures but routine operations. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued into 1946. Yamada finally departed Tinian in February 1946, aboard an American transport ship that reversed the journey he had made as a prisoner. Returning to Japan, he found a nation transformed by defeat. Cities lay in ruins. The population was hungry. American occupation forces controlled every aspect of governance. The emperor had renounced his divinity. Everything familiar had vanished. Yamada's family had survived miraculously, though their Tokyo home had burned in the March 10th firebombing. They had evacuated to relatives in the countryside and lived through the final months of war on minimal rations. His wife wept when he appeared, alive and healthy. His children, who had been told he died heroically in battle, struggled to understand that their father had spent the war's final year as a prisoner. Reintegrating into Japanese society proved difficult for former prisoners. The shame of capture lingered despite official attempts to frame surrender as a complex moral issue rather than simple cowardice. Yamada found work eventually, using his technical background in civilian aviation development. But he never escaped the knowledge he had gained as a prisoner. He had seen American industrial might firsthand. He understood how thoroughly Japan had been outmatched. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became an economic powerhouse, Yamada occasionally discussed his prisoner of war experience with trusted friends. He described watching B-29s depart on their 3,000-mile missions and understanding, perhaps for the first time, what true industrial power meant. Not just building weapons, but building them in such quantities that individual losses were irrelevant. Not just conducting operations, but sustaining them indefinitely with continuously improving efficiency. The lesson of the B-29, Yamada came to believe, was not primarily about aviation technology. It was about national priorities and industrial organization. America had built an economy capable of producing 3,970 superfortresses, while simultaneously building thousands of other aircraft, ships, tanks, and weapons. That productivity did not emerge from natural resources alone. The Soviet Union had vast resources, but could not match American production. It emerged from industrial organization, technological innovation, and economic systems that motivated maximum output. Japan's post-war economic miracle drew lessons from wartime defeat. The industrial capacity that Japanese forces could not match militarily became a model for post-war development. Japanese industry studied American manufacturing techniques, quality control methods, and production systems. The same organizational principles that had built B-29s eventually helped build Toyota automobiles and Sony electronics. Defeat became education, and education became foundation for reconstruction. Other Japanese prisoners of war had similar experiences. Those who survived repatriation and reintegrated into civilian life carried knowledge of American capabilities that shaped their post-war perspectives. They had seen the source of American power, not just military technology, but industrial organization and economic productivity. This knowledge influenced how post-war Japan approached reconstruction and development. The specific number of Japanese prisoners who witnessed B-29 operations directly is difficult to determine. Prisoners held in the Marianas certainly saw them. Those held in Australia, New Zealand, and India may have encountered B-29s at other bases. Prisoners transferred to the United States for intelligence purposes would have seen American aviation capabilities more broadly. But even those who never saw a superfortress directly understood what it represented through interrogations, conversations, and simple observation of American material abundance. The broader impact of Japanese prisoner of war experiences extended beyond individuals to influence post-war Japanese society. These men returned home with first-hand knowledge that contradicted wartime propaganda. They had been treated humanely when taught to expect torture. They had witnessed industrial capacity that exceeded propaganda claims of American weakness. They had learned that American workers were neither lazy nor incompetent, but highly productive and well-organized. This knowledge, shared through family networks and communities, helped undermine militaristic thinking that had led Japan into war. The B-29 continued flying after World War II, serving in Korea and various other roles until retirement in the early 1960s. But its historical significance remained tied to the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. The Superfortress had demonstrated that with sufficient industrial capacity and engineering skill, distance could be conquered. The 3,000-mile missions that Japanese planners thought impossible became routine operations that destroyed Japan's capacity to wage war. For prisoners like Yamada, the sound of those Wright R-3350 engines remained unforgettable. The ground-shaking roar as hundreds of bombers departed, the sight of silver aircraft climbing toward Japan, the knowledge that each mission represented industrial, logistical, and organizational capabilities Japan could never match. That sound marked the moment when theoretical understanding became visceral certainty. America possessed power so overwhelming that Japanese defeat was inevitable. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan remains controversial. Casualty figures from incendiary attacks on civilian areas were horrific. Questions about the necessity and morality of such destruction continue to generate debate. But for Japanese prisoners who witnessed the campaign from Allied camps, the moral questions were complicated by military realities. They understood that Japan would not surrender while retaining any capacity to resist. Total destruction of Japanese war-making ability became necessary because Japanese military culture rejected any alternative to unconditional surrender. Yamada lived into the 1980s, witnessing Japan's transformation from defeated empire to economic superpower. Late in life, he occasionally gave interviews about his wartime experiences. He spoke carefully, aware that Japanese society remained sensitive about the war, but he insisted on one point. The B-29 missions taught him that modern warfare was decided by industrial capacity, not military valor. Nations that could build such aircraft in such quantities would defeat nations that could not, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical skill. His final interview, conducted in 1983, included a poignant reflection. The interviewer asked whether he had felt anger watching B-29s depart to bomb his homeland. Yamada paused for a long time before answering. "Not anger," he finally said. "Despair. I knew each mission brought Japan closer to destruction, but I also knew we had brought this upon ourselves by attacking an enemy we could not defeat. The Americans were not cruel. They were simply stronger, overwhelmingly stronger." The story of Japanese prisoners witnessing B-29 operations ultimately illustrates how technological and industrial superiority can reshape not just military outcomes, but human understanding. These men had believed in Japanese superiority based on propaganda and limited information. Direct exposure to American capabilities destroyed those beliefs through undeniable evidence. The 3,000-mile missions were not merely military operations. They were demonstrations of national power so comprehensive that they converted enemies into witnesses of their own defeat. The lesson extended beyond individuals to influence post-war Japan's trajectory. The nation that had sought empire through military conquest rebuilt itself through economic development. The industrial capacity that Japan could not match militarily became a model for post-war growth. Understanding American power, truly understanding it through direct observation rather than intelligence reports, helped post-war Japanese leaders make better strategic decisions than their wartime predecessors. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.